Hey there everybody, it's James Rowe, and today we are going to be doing Lesson 9 in the Novak After Effects series. This is our very last class. For those of you who've stuck with me since the beginning, I hope you've enjoyed it. Today we're going to be going over some kind of miscellaneous graphic design, motion graphic elements that I think are important to know. Keep in mind that all of the things I've shown you guys are more or less samples of things that you can do in After Effects. The one tutorial that I did maybe last week to make a logo or something like that spin around or reveal itself, obviously, you should take that knowledge and practice it and apply it to other things, maybe not just logos, but to, other titles or other pieces of graphic design or something like that. So don't just take these individual tutorials as a map to do one thing. These are all tools, and it's intended for you to get out there and experiment with those tools on other tasks. So let's go ahead and open up Lesson 9, the Lesson 9 delivery folder that I sent you guys. And we're going to be doing 3 different compositions today. One thing that we didn't get to last week that I wanted to get to, it was Photoshop integration. So we talked all last week about Illustrator integration and how important that is in After Effects. I wanted to flip the coin and do Photoshop this week to show you guys some cool things that you can do with titles and motion graphics using that software and After Effects at the same time. I also wanted to review some camera animation stuff and show how you could use a camera in After Effects, a 3D camera, to create some cool effects. And the last thing that I wanted to go over today, and the first thing that we're going to start with, is using what's called the puppet pen tool to animate characters or other pieces of art. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up the Banksy composition here. Okay, so we've got an empty wall here. I just pulled this image right off of Google. I've got this picture of the wall, and let's go ahead and go into the stills folder here, and you should find a banksy.png image. So I'm going to go ahead and left click on that and drag it down and drop it onto my Banksy composition there. And you'll see kind of this famous piece of art, at least it's kind of redolent of that famous piece of Banksy artwork. This has been converted by an artist online and uploaded as a vector image. So, it's not the original, but it looks very similar to the one that's so famous. So anyways, you've got this picture of this child here. She's reaching for a balloon and it's floating away. So one really cool thing that you can do with artwork like this in After Effects is use the puppet pen tool to animate it, to give it a sense of motion. So that's what we're going to be doing today. You could use this same tool to do semi-full character animations in After Effects, but I don't necessarily recommend it. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find a good location for this image, and I'm going to go ahead and scale it and adjust it to whatever I think looks best for the animation. Keep in mind that we're going to want to keep the balloon in the frame because we're going to be animating it so that it's flying away. And then we're also going to animate her so that she's kind of reaching out for it as it flies away from her. So go ahead and take a couple minutes and reframe this up to whatever you think looks best. Alright, so I just got done reframing there, and I've got this everything kind of lined up the way I pretty much wanted it. I ended up scaling it down about 70%, and then I put her more or less in center right frame to allow the balloon to kind of fly through this negative space over here. Now, when I'm zooming in on this image and I'm looking at it 100%, the first thing that pops out to me is this is very obviously a composite, and it doesn't look photorealistic in any regard. And that's because the colors of the artwork itself that I downloaded off the internet there are not interacting with the colors of that wall, with the colors of the image beneath it. And that is where those blending modes come into play. Now, if you've had me since the beginning of this series, you're probably very familiar with blending modes at this point. But if not, we'll go ahead and recap that as we go here. So what you have to do is remember that every single pixel of an image is given a specific red, green, and blue value, a very objective, measurable red, green, and blue value. It's a number. And if you hover your mouse over any given piece of art or pixel in After Effects and you look up here, okay, so I've got my info tab open in the right hand side. That's normally open for just the default, window, workspace, standard there. If you hover your mouse over any given pixel in your composition, you'll actually see the red, green, and blue values. So you can see the red value there is red 30326, the green is 3470, and the blue is 4498. So that is the number, those three numbers, the red, green, and blue numbers, add together through what's called the additive light or additive color process to create that particular color of red. Now if I hover my mouse over here on the wall, you can see that there's totally different numbers of gray and white and kind of tan that it's going over as I move my mouse. So that's more or less how the computer can identify the color of a pixel and show it to you. Without those specific numbers, those codes, it's almost like a recipe, right? You've got your red number, your green number, and your blue number, and you add those together, and that is the color that you get. Every single color, regardless of whatever color it is, gets a red number, a green number, and a blue number, because those are the primary colors of light with which we work so regularly in the film and television industry. When you have these numbers here, what that enables us to do is do mathematical operations with those numbers. So I can see right here in my timeline, there's a column there that says mode, and that stands for the blending mode of the layer itself. Now if you don't, for whatever reason, see that column there, make sure that your left two buttons down here in the very bottom left-hand corner of your timeline are active, and then you should be able to see that mode column. So what this mode does is, if I click on that and I look at, I've got the big drop-down menu here of all these different what are called blending modes. And each one of these is more or less a mathematical operation that's going to take the color values, those numerical color values for every pixel of the lower image, and apply them to the numerical values of the pixels of the upper image. Now each individual, blending mode is kind of its own formula, and some of them are extremely complicated. But you also have really, really simple ones, like this one, add. So if I click right here on add under Banksy, okay, so I've got my Banksy layer selected. Under mode, I click on that and I go to add. It's going to add all of the colors together from the lower layer and the upper layer. And what ends up happening there is that the balloon is pretty much the only thing that gets shown. And the reason behind that is because black in a digital system, look up there in your top right hand corner, is always represented as red 0, green 0, and blue 0. So we all know that like 1 plus 0 is always going to be 1. So when you add black to an image, it's just going to end up, whatever the color is beneath it is going to be the color. So in this case, it's black plus grayish tan equals, grayish tan. That's as simple as that. The other one that you can look at that's very simple and easy to understand is the multiply one right here. And that is taking the values of the top image and it's multiplying it by those numerical values of the bottom image. And that's where we're starting to get some actual, progress in the way that we want things to look here. So you can see right here, black times tan, okay, 0 times tan is 0. So you're going to get pure black in this instance. Same thing with the string right here, but look where the red multiplied to the tan and the wall texture beneath it. You can see there that these colors have really married with one another really well, and what ends up happening is there's kind of the illusion at this point that this piece of art has been painted on that wall, because you can see the texture of the wall beneath it. So for this particular instance here, the red is working really nicely with the wall, but the black is still pure black because it's just zeroing out any value that's underneath it. What you can do here when you're using a multiply like this and you've got black in your image is you can actually shallow out this super black information right here just by going to the layer properties and changing the opacity of the layer. So right now the opacity of the layer is 100%. That's pure black right there. But if I drop the opacity, it's going to start blending in that black with the wall beneath it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now until I find something that looks pretty good. So maybe 75% or 70% opacity or something like that. That's starting to look pretty good to me because it's still showing me black, right? That really dark color. Maybe I'll go a little bit more bold with it. But it's also showing the texture of the wall beneath it. So I think this is a really good choice for this particular piece of art. Keep in mind though that you can go through here and experiment with any one of these different blending modes and try and figure out which one works best. To me, multiply works best, but you might have a different opinion. Now you might say to yourself when you're looking at these blending modes, man, how do I remember all of these individual blending modes and what each one does? Well, number one, you're never going to have to memorize the formula for some of these guys, right? So like this screen blending mode is really probably a multi-part, pretty serious looking mathematical formula where it's taking the colors of these two images and it's putting them through. So you don't got to do that calculus, man. You don't got to do that algebra or whatever it's called. Trust me, you should have seen my GRE score in math. It's terrible. You don't have to know that stuff. After Effects does all that for you. But how do you know what each one does? The menu is always here, and you can always just kind of toggle down through as many as you want to try and look and see which one works best. And I still do that. I still come in here and I just kind of start going down the list, man. Which one is going to give me the best looking result? Alright, so I'm pretty happy with that. And if we play this sequence back now, we've got just kind of a cool shot of a fake Banksy along a fake wall doing nothing. It's very static, okay? And that might work in some circumstances, sure. But this is After Effects. This is not Photoshop, right? Let's add some motion to this. The first thing I'm going to do before I get into that animation is I'm going to go ahead and compare my two images that I've composited together here. Now the first one, this wall. If I'm looking at it, that's taken with a real camera, and it's a pretty decent camera. You can see by the level of detail that it's captured. It's probably not a phone, but it's also not necessarily perfectly sharp. And there's a lot of areas where a camera, even a good camera, can give you a slightly soft image. One is the sensor of the camera, and the other one is the type of glass, the lens that's in front of the camera there. A lot of the times a lens element will never be 100% perfectly sharp, and because of that, we end up with images like this, where it looks reasonably sharp, but the resolution is not perfect, and the lens itself was probably making it a little less sharp as well. So you've got a very slightly blurry image back there. Even though things look more or less in focus, the image is still slightly blurred. Now, on the flip side, when I'm looking at my Banksy here, this is a piece of digital art. It never saw the light of day at any capacity. Someone came in and took a picture of the Banksy artwork, and then they traced it in probably Adobe Illustrator, and then they exported it as a PNG file. This is a totally synthetic image, and as a result, you have perfect sharpness on the edges. So, when I'm analyzing this, for starters, I'm going to make sure that I apply a slight blur to this so that it sits a little bit better on the wall. And the sharpness of the digital art matches the sharpness of the real wall that it's sitting on. So to do that, I'm just going to make sure Banksy is selected here, and I'm going to go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, And for this instance, I'm just going to go to Fast Box Blur. That's my old faithful, my old reliable. Plenty of other options to choose from here, but this will never do you wrong in most circumstances. And I'm just going to slightly increase my blur radius here to add the blur to it. It's always set at 0, so you can see when I have it set to 0, nothing's actually happening. So I'll change my blur radius maybe to 1. And look at that. We've already automatically got, you know, a slightly blurrier image, and that's probably almost a little bit too blurry, so I'm going to drop that down a little bit, maybe 0.8 or something like that. Go ahead and adjust that blur value to whatever you think sits best within the image. So one more thing I want to mention here before we move on and use this puppet tool is that the puppet pen tool works best when you are using an image that has transparency information around the character, which is to say the character is isolated and is, you know, in the image, it's just the character. There's no background behind them, and the background definitely isn't burned into the image behind them. So in this case, you know, the little girl and the balloon, they're sitting already perfectly. Even if I take my multiply off, you know, they're sitting in my opacity. They're sitting perfectly on the wall already, and there's nothing, you know, there's no background or anything from this original Banksy image that's getting, you know, stuck onto this composite. So if I were to come up here and go to Layer, New, Solid, and I'll just create like a light blue layer there, and just drop it underneath the Banksy image, you could see there that the character is sitting on top of blue now. It's not sitting on top of the wall, and so is the balloon. So both of these objects have no backgrounds to them whatsoever. They're just transparent. So that's really important for this pen tool. If you've got a character that is sitting on an image with a background burned into it, you probably need to go into Photoshop and separate that character out from the background. Otherwise, the pen tool will kind of be a frustrating experience for you, and it probably won't work the way that you want it to work. So I'm going to go ahead and engage the pen tool here, and the first thing that we're going to animate is the balloon, because that's going to give you a really good sense of how this works. So with my Banksy layer selected here, I'm going to come up to my toolbar, and I'm going to use the Puppet Position Pen tool right here. It's a little thumbtack. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. So with my pen tool active, before I start adding some pins into this, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my playhead is parked at frame 0. Very, very, very important. So I'm just going to drag my playhead all the way to the beginning of the composition. Make sure it's parked right there. Now I'm going to make sure Banksy is selected in my layer, you know, stack in the timeline, and then I'm just going to zoom in a little bit so I can get a better view. And with my pen tool, what you can think of as the, you know, this tool, this puppet pen tool, is that it's more or less kind of like an elbow. Every single point that I put down gives control over that particular area, and it can rotate and move that particular part of the image as if it were a bone structure of some kind. So I'm going to come down here to the very beginning of my string, and I'm just going to left click once. And you can see once you do that and you add your first puppet pen tool in there, it breaks the image down that you've added the pen to into what's called a mesh. And this mesh is vaguely redolent of the mesh that you would use in a 3D animation software to animate you know, a dinosaur or Godzilla or whatever it may be. So you've got this mesh here. The image is now broken down not by its entirety, all right, not just by this massive pixels, but it's actually, After Effects has now broken it down into these individual polygons, okay? And these polygons can now be kind of individually moved around, and that will create a sense of movement in the image as we move them. So I've added this first pin tool here, and I'm going to go ahead and add another pin anywhere that I think that there would be some kind of flex or movement along the string. So you can see right here that this string is kind of elbowing out right here. So I'm going to go ahead and put a pin right there. I'll put another pin right here, kind of near this elbow where it's flexing outwards. I'll put another pin right here, kind of at the base of the string. And I'll put another pin right here, kind of the tail, this little pigtail here. And what I can do now is, with these pins active, okay, you'll notice what happens. Watch. I'll grab one of these pins, and I can now move the string around. Okay? So I can move any of these pins around, and that's going to kind of animate the string. So you can see what happens is that the pin itself attaches itself to that area of the mesh, and then when you grab it and move it around, After Effects is kind of warping the image so that the mesh remains intact as you do so. Okay, so when I'm moving these pins around, you can see that my balloon is kind of nodding back and forth as I move the tail of the string around. And that's because there's no pins inside of the balloon. The pins are, they're kind of like glue. So if I put a pin right here in my balloon at the very top of the balloon, and I grab and move my string around a little bit, you can see right there that the balloon is no longer moving, and that's because it has its own pin, and the mesh of the balloon itself is no longer dependent on these other pins for its animation information. It's looking to this one now for that detail. So you can see here I can grab this particular pin and kind of move it around, and there's a certain degree of extremity that you can go here before it starts to look weird, right? For this particular animation, we don't necessarily want to stretch this image out or anything. And if I grab this pin and I go really far with it, it's going to stretch the image out. You're going to end up something like that. So that's not necessarily something that you want to do here. You've got to kind of keep the movements at least more or less realistically. And the same thing exactly happens when you're doing a 3D animation of a person using a mesh like this in Maya or something like that. Okay, so now that I've got my pins in for this particular area of the mesh, let's go ahead and look at what's happening down on the timeline, because this is very important. Number one, on the layer itself, you'll now see a puppet effect has been added in the effects category. Okay, so my transform controls are there. Under the effects panel, there's my box blur that I added earlier. That's not what we're looking at, but there's puppet. So I can click on puppet there, twirl that thing down, and now I should see mesh 1. Mesh 1. So I'm going to go ahead and twirl that down and open that up. And inside of mesh 1, I now have a deform category. So I'm going to open that up as well. And there's all the pins. So if I look down here at the pins themselves on the timeline, I'm just going to move my playhead off. Look at that. Every one of them has automatically been keyframed for this particular, model. So that's something very important. The moment that you put a pin down, it's going to automatically be keyframed on the timeline. And that's why when you're doing an animation, you should always have your playhead at 0, or whenever you want the animation, you need to park your playhead right there at that moment before you start adding in your pins. Otherwise, you'll have keyframes kind of starting, wherever your playhead is, if it's an arbitrary location. So this is a lot of pins, and this is just a big mess of, disclosure triangles and all that. So I'm going to actually close up everything on this layer, and I'm just going to select the layer and hit the U key to just show the animated parameters. And that's just going to open up whatever's been animated, and now I have those keyframes at my disposal right there. So it's much neater. Always use that U key to tighten up and tidy up your timeline. Okay, now that I have that done, all right, they're already automatically keyframed in their original position. So let's go ahead and animate this thing. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to animate the position of the balloon, and this has nothing whatsoever to do with my puppet tool. So I'm going to come over here and just select the layer itself, and I'm going to turn off the puppet position tool here and go back to my regular old selection tool, the V key. Now that I've got that selected, I can move my layer around here. And we're going to move this balloon kind of in an upwards direction, and you're going to see, you know, the little girl, she's also going to move with the balloon, but that's okay for right now because we're going to go back and take care of her in a minute. So we're going to move this balloon and animate it so that it's kind of floating upwards. And then we're going to use the puppet tool to animate the string and kind of the flex of the balloon so that it looks more realistic and looks like it's a real balloon kind of floating up. So with my playhead parked at 0 or wherever I want to start this animation, I'm going to go zoom out on my timeline a little bit. I'm going to come over here, and with my layer selected, I'll hit the P key, and it'll open up the position parameter. And I'm just going to go ahead and hit my stopwatch on the position to add a keyframe there. And I'll go all the way to the very end of the composition, or wherever I want the animation to stop. And I'm just going to drag the balloon upwards a little bit. Now once again, the little girl's moving with us, but that's okay. Not a big deal right now. Okay, so now let's take a look at that. I'm just going to preview that. Okay, I think that's a pretty decent speed for this particular animation that I'm looking for. Now, obviously, it's kind of slow, but I think that works for this particular composition. You may obviously want to animate something much faster. Okay, so now I've got this kind of upward left traveling balloon there. Now let's go in with the puppet tool itself and animate these individual pins so that the string is kind of fluttering in the air and the balloon is flexing around a little bit. Again, I'll click on my layer right there, Banksy layer, and hit the U key. That's going to open up all of those individual pins. And you can come in here and like right click on one of these pins and go to rename. This is always a good thing. This is something that the 3D animation industry does. And I could just rename this pin to the upper balloon pin or something like that. If you've got a ton of pins inside of your mesh, you may want to rename all of them so that you can keep track of which one is doing which. For our instances though, for our case though, it's not necessarily important to do that. This is pretty simple. So I'm going to go ahead and move my playhead to where I want my animation to end, and in this case it's just at the very end of the composition. I've already got the original starting position of all those puppet pins keyframed automatically just by creating them. So at the end here, with my playhead parked at the end, I could just move these puppet pins around to change the shape, and After Effects is going to keep track of those changes and then animate the balloon for me. So now I've got my playhead at the end. I'm just going to zoom in, and I'm going to move this string around a little bit for starters. So this balloon is kind of flying upwards, and I'm going to go ahead and straighten out the string so it looks like it's kind of gaining velocity as it moves upwards. So I'm just going to go ahead and come over here to my pin tool, my puppet pins, and I'm just going to straighten out the string a little bit. And maybe with this little itty bitty extra string here, maybe I'll move that upwards kind of like that so that it's coming towards the other one. And then maybe I'll just kind of move my balloon around ever so slightly. So I just more or less established a new ending position for all of these puppet pins. And if I go back to my beginning, you can see the puppet pin animate over time. And there you have it. So you've got kind of a cool little simple animation of that balloon flying upwards. The string is kind of moving organically or roughly organically as it goes. Now if I wanted to come in here and really tweak this, I could kind of park my playhead in the middle somewhere, and I can kind of move each one of these pins kind of individually from one another. So I can come over here and maybe move the, this particular pin so that it kind of flexes at a higher speed or a slower speed than the others. And I can just kind of individually animate each pin so that I have a more organic effect, and they're not all kind of just moving at the same velocity towards the same end state goal. And that's something that you can just play around with. There's no right or wrong answer for that whatsoever, right? You can just kind of play around with that, and maybe even at the end you can continue to tweak them to add more keyframes so they change position again. So you can have the string kind of fluttering or anything there. So that's a little bit more organic of an effect because, the string, all of those pins are not moving at the same time from one another, and that just kind of creates a little bit more organic effect. So take a couple minutes and play around with this pin tool and find the animation that works best for you. Okay, I'm pretty happy with this result. I think it looks pretty decent. So I'm going to go ahead and move on now to animating the little girl, which is a much more complicated task. The first thing we need to do before we do that is we need to isolate this balloon from the little girl, right? Because she's obviously traveling upwards with the balloon now, which is kind of interesting in its own right, I guess, but it's also not very, it's kind of strange looking. So let's go ahead and isolate the balloon from the little girl. The best way to do that is just going to be a simple mask. So I'll park my playhead at the very beginning of the shot, of the animation, and I'll make sure the layer is selected. And what I can do is I can just come in here with a simple rectangle tool and just draw a rectangle around my balloon right there. And so now I've got the balloon masked off. And the mask is going to move with the layer itself, so it's not like I have to animate the mask over time because it's just moving with the layer coordinates as they are. I do see that I'm starting to get close to the very edge of my string, so I might adjust my mask size ever so slightly right there. But again, that's not an animation, just a very rough, easy mask right there. Okay, so now we've got the balloon isolated. The next thing that we have to do is isolate the little girl, and that's going to be a little bit trickier. Okay, so to get the girl back, I'm just going to select that Banksy layer, and I'll just hit the Control D or Command D button on the keyboard, and that's going to duplicate it. And now I'm just going to get rid of the things that we don't need for this new layer. I'm going to right click first and go to rename, and I'm just going to call this girl, and I'll also rename the bottom layer balloon so I know which one is which as I animate things here. On the girl layer, the first thing I'm going to delete is the mask, so I'll just open up the layer controls there, and I'll delete the mask off of there. And then I also want to go ahead and delete the puppet tool from the effects in there as well. So go to the effects little area there in your layer controls, select the puppet effect, and go ahead and delete that because that's storing all of these other puppet points. Now we're going to go ahead and and one last thing before we move on, we need to get rid of this position, right? Because the girl is still kind of floating upwards here. So I'm going to come over here to my layer where the girl is, and I'm just going to deactivate the animation by clicking off of that stopwatch right there. And that's going to get rid of those keyframes, and now the girl's kind of just stuck there. Okay, so now we've got the girl isolated, or at least she's not moving. And now we're going to draw a mask around the girl. And the reason that I'm going to draw a mask around the girl here is not only just to isolate her from the balloon and get rid of this stationary balloon that she now has. It's also to make my puppet tool work correctly. And I just want you guys to watch what's going to happen here. So if I come over here and I were to drop Banksy back in, and I'm just going to get rid of my other, I'm just turning off, hiding my other actual layers. So this is just an example here. When I've got just the Banksy layer in there by itself, and I don't have any masks or anything applied to it, and I come over here to my pen tool and I add some pins onto this little girl, well, you'll see what happens. It's using the transparency information to determine the mesh. And in this case, we've got these islands of black in the mesh that are totally separate and isolated from the rest of the mesh itself. So this is very, very problematic. So there's her arm, it's separate. There's her eyeballs and her nose. Those are all separate, meshes. And that's, it would be a big pain, because now if I come in here with my pen tool and I animate her, I try to animate her, like her face is going to be still stuck to the wall. Now I can add something to that mesh, but now I have two meshes that I have to animate simultaneously that are not going to be reacting to the movement of the other mesh. So at this point, to effectively animate this little girl, I've got 6 meshes here that each need to be animated at this point to be effective. That is going to be painstaking. It's going to be hard to make it look right. The girl's face is probably going to get deformed at some point, and things are just going to be a pain in the ass. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to come back here. I'm going to delete that layer, and I'm going to go back to the layer that I created of the little girl. What we're going to do is we're going to draw a mask around this little girl, and when we draw a mask around her, what's going to happen is After Effects is going to use the mask as the mesh information instead of the transparency of the layer itself. And it'll combine all of these individual islands of black into one individual mesh, and I'll be able to animate it appropriately. So to do that, I need to do a little more advanced mask around her than the balloon. We just used the old rectangle mask over here on the balloon, and that worked fine. But for this, we really need to follow kind of, not precisely, but generally follow the contours of her body to get that right. So I'm going to make sure that the girl layer is selected, and I'm going to come up here to my pen tool, select that, and now I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm just going to start roughly following the contours of the art. And again, I've got some fat on the edges. I'm not trying to be precise here, There's absolutely no reason to be precise. It's a waste of your time, and it'll probably mess everything up in the end. So just roughly sketch her out here. And where I need to get really detailed, since she's going to be reaching for that balloon, I need to be a little bit more detailed around her hand, because that's where the majority of this animation is going to be happening. I'm just going to come in here and add just a few more points than I did to the other areas of the image. Same thing with her face. I'm going to be a little more detailed around her face. And there we go. We'll go ahead and close that mask out by clicking on the first point. And now I've got her more or less roughly surrounded by a mask there. Now, two things have happened. You know, it's first off, the balloon is gone. That stationary balloon is gone, right? Because we've drawn a mask around her. So the stationary balloon that she came with is no longer there, which is good. And the second thing is that After Effects is now going to see this mask as the mesh itself. And the transparency information that was brought in is no longer going to be considered viable for the creation of the mesh. Okay, so now let's get on with using the puppet pin tool to animate this little girl. So to do this particular animation, I'm going to use two of the regular old puppet pins, but then I'm going to use what are called rotation pins, which are different and they're more effective for this particular type of animation. So to add the regular old puppet pins, I'll just click on the puppet pin tool there. And I'm going to come down here to her feet. And I'll just put pins generally where her feet are. You can see now that the mesh is following the contours of the mask. It's not following the contours of that transparency information. Okay, so I've got those two regular old puppet pins in there. Now we're going to be using what are called rotation pins. And to activate the rotation pin tool, I'm going to left click and hold on the pin tool here. And I'll go to the puppet, it's called the puppet bend tool. I'm sorry, I was calling it the puppet rotation tool. The puppet bend pin tool is what we want. And I'm just going to add those in places where I think there will be some bending, okay? So the first place will be her waist. She's going to be kind of bending forward as she reaches for that balloon. So maybe I'll put a puppet pin right around where her waist is. You can see there that this is a very different looking pin. And what it does is on the outer reaches of the pin, you now have a circle. And if I left click and grab on that circle, it lets me rotate the mesh in its completion. Now because I've got those other two pins down below, those regular old pins down below, those are serving as kind of anchor points, just like her real feet would be. So I can kind of rock her back and forth and her feet stays on the ground. Okay, so now I've got a rotation pin or a bend pin activated there. The next place I'm going to do it is mostly around her arms. So I'll come over here and I'll put one more or less where all of her joints are, right? So I'm going to put a rotation pin here. I'll put another one here at her elbow. I'll put another one at her wrist. And then I'm going to put two kind of over here where her fingers are. Okay, so now you can see that as I added those pins in, After Effects creates increasingly complicated meshes to compensate for those new pins. So it's making the mesh much more finer in detail because it knows this particular area with all of its pins is going to be heavily animated and will need, you know, more mesh polygons to successfully warp the image. Okay, so I've got all that done there. And once again, if I hit the girl layer in my timeline and hit the U key, you should see all of those puppet pins have now been activated, and they're also keyframed. Now, if for some reason you had your playhead over here when you were doing that work or whatever, and all of your keyframes are over here, it's not to worry, okay? You can just select them, highlight them like I'm doing, so I'm just lassoing them. Left clicking on an empty area of the timeline, dragging that lasso around to select all of them until they're all blue. And I can just drag them left like so. And I'll lock them over at frame 0, just where they should be. And now I'll move my playhead all the way to the end, and I'm going to use my new pins here to animate the image. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to animate her waist. Again, I got my playhead at the end here. So I'll click on that one bend pin, and I'm just going to hover my mouse over the circle of the bend pin until I get that little rotation cursor, and then I'll left click and hold, and I'm just going to bend her forward ever so slightly. Again, this is one of those things where it's like, you know, if you overdo it, it's going to look weird. So don't overdo it. Don't put her down here on the concrete. Whoa, look at that. That's crazy looking. Okay. Now as she bends forward, I'm also going to rotate her arm so that it's reaching progressively higher. So I'll go over here to her shoulder, and I'll activate that pin, and I'll rotate that one upwards. And maybe to her elbow so that it bends a little bit upwards as well. And then to her wrist so that it's bending upwards. And then I'll even rotate her fingers so that there's a little bit more movement in her hands. Now you can animate that however much you want, and I hope you take some time to experiment. But just to show you what kind of effect we're creating here. As she's reaching up for the balloon while it's flowing away. So, the puppet pen tool is extremely effective at doing work like this. What I do not recommend the puppet pen tool for is creating advanced character animations. It's simply not something that you're going to want to do. Most of the time, cartoons and things like that are animated in different applications. Adobe Flash, or I believe it's called Animate now, is kind of a better solution for this type of animation. You could always, of course, try and animate something in After Effects using just the puppet pen tool, a cartoon of some kind, but it would be more painstaking and it would take a pretty long time and would probably need some workarounds to get it to look perfectly correct. But this is a really great, simple animation tool to immediately breathe life into pieces of art and other graphics that you might bring into your compositions. So I hope that you could use this pen tool in the future. All right, now that I've got kind of my rough animation there, the next thing I'll do is I'm going to add a layer of color correction to this to make it look a little bit nicer than it is now. That wall is pretty boring back there. So to do that, to color correct all of these layers at once, if you remember kind of from some of our previous classes, the best way to do that is to use what's called an adjustment layer. So I'll come up here to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. It'll pop that layer right down on the timeline at the top of everything, and that's more or less where we want it. I'll right click on it and I'll just rename it to Color Grade. And now I'll come back over here to Effect, Color Correction, and I'll apply a simple Lumetri color effect to it. And if you're not familiar with Lumetri, this is kind of Adobe's main color correction software. It's used in Adobe Premiere, it's used in After Effects, and it's also used to some extent in what's called Adobe SpeedGrade, which is their version of more or less DaVinci Resolve or something like that. You've got a lot of different adjustments up here that you can make. The first one is the basic correction panel, and that allows you to control very basic things like the color temperature of the image. Okay, so if I wanted to warm it up, I can drag this value upwards and it's going to add orange to it, which is kind of cool looking. If I wanted it to cool it down, I could drag it downwards and add more blue to it progressively. So that's kind of, you know, orange to blue on the color wheel. And on the opposite side of that, we have tint. So if I grab tint and I drag it upwards, it's going to progressively add magenta to the image. And if I drag it left, it's going to add green to the image. This is not, a coincidence. On set, you're normally dealing with 4 colors of light. You're dealing with sunlight, which is bluish. You're dealing with old-fashioned tungsten fixtures like old light bulbs. Those are normally orange. And then you're dealing with fluorescents that are green. And you might also be dealing with things like sodium vapor lights or other types of light which are more magenta. So those are kind of the 4 main light temperatures that you work with, and that's more or less what Adobe put those in there for, is to help correct for those 4 main sources of light that you run into on set. Exposure is more or less the exposure of the image, so it's kind of adjusting the exposure upwards the same way a camera might if you were shooting it. Contrast is the steepness of the curve between black and white. So if I adjust that upwards, it's going to make black things blacker and white things whiter. And then I also have luminance adjustments for the highlights, the shadow areas, and other controls there. So the adjustment that I'm going to use is actually the curves panel. So I'm going to come over here to curves. And now we've got a lookup table here. If you're not familiar with a lookup table, it's more or less an input graph. Okay, so we have our input values here. Those are luminance values. And then we have our output values on the y-axis. And we can add points to this curve and adjust it accordingly to brighten it up or darken it. If you're unfamiliar with these things, I encourage you to take the beginners After Effects class that I posted for Novak. It'll give you a much better idea of how these individual controls work. So I'm just going to go ahead and darken up my shadow areas ever so slightly there, just not too much, but just to add a little contrast to the image. And then maybe I'll come back here and add some warmth into my color temperature. Okay, make it a little bit warmer. And then at the very end, at the very bottom, maybe I'll come in here and do a simple vignette. Drag that vignette value down into the negative, and it's going to start darkening the edges of the frame. So you can experiment with those color correction controls and take a look and see if there's anything you can come up with that you think looks good. Once you're done with that, the thing that you would do, the thing that I would do when I do work like this, is you have to stitch the image together. And right now the image is still kind of composite-y, right? We've got a digital image sitting on a real image, neither of which are inherently moving. Okay, we've animated them, but they're not alive with video noise. They do not look as though they were filmed in an organic way. So one thing that I do to stitch almost all of my composites together and to create a greater sense of realism is to just add a slight layer of video noise to the entire image so that, everything looks like it was kind of shot by a real camera. So I'll come up here to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer again. Keep that up at the top. I'll right click on it, I'll go to Rename, and I'll just call this Video Noise. And I'll come up here with the Video Noise Adjustment Layer selected. I'll go to Effect, Noise, and I'll just add a noise effect to it. And normally for this type of work, you don't want to overdo this value. I can drag this upwards to like 100 and it's going to add a bunch of fuzz to it, right? Looks like old video or something. So maybe I'll just do it 2%, maybe a little bit more, 5% maybe. Okay, so now video noise has been added. Okay, if I turn that off and on, you should be able to see it ever so slightly there. Video noise has been added to the entire image. So to recap the way these adjustment layers work, anything layer that sits beneath an adjustment layer is going to be adjusted. Okay, so I've got my color grade layer here, and the layer itself is empty, right? It's just, there's no content to the layer. It's just an invisible layer. But when I add an effect to it, like this Lumetri color effect, it's going to apply, its effect, that Lumetri color, to all of the layers that sit beneath it. So the girl, the balloon, and the old vintage wall here are all getting that color information from the Lumetri effect. I added a second adjustment layer on top of that called the video noise layer, and that is adding video noise to all of the layers beneath it, including the color grade layer. So normally I'll do a color grade or a color correction layer, and then at the very top above all of the other layers, I normally add just a slight layer of video noise to it. And this goes for visual effects work and for motion graphics work. Adding just a slight bit of video noise automatically makes the image seem as though it was filmed on a real camera, and it also just kind of stitches the images together and makes them seem like they're part of an organic whole, because they're all being affected by a little bit of video noise at the same time. Highly recommend using noise, adding in noise to an image. I know that seems contradictory. People are like, man, I don't even like noise in my still images. I don't like it when my video noise is, my video has noise in it. Why would I degrade the image? I promise, if you degrade it 1% using a little bit of video noise, it adds so much more production value. Okay, so that's it for this particular composition. Let's move on to using Adobe Photoshop to create a nice title and incorporating a title into a real-world scene using Photoshop. Okay, so I've got, if you open up the Jackson Square composition here, I've got a time lapse from a little while ago, and I've got a sign here on Jackson Square, and you can see all those people zipping by in the background. Pretty stable shot, got the clouds flying over and all that. So in the past, we've been kind of throwing titles into these environments, and the title sits in the environment. It looks like it's kind of part of the environment, but it's not necessarily organic looking. One way that I love to create really distinct titles is to take a sign from a real-world environment, erase that sign, and then put your title into it. So that's what we're going to be doing with this particular sign right here. So you can see this is like a French market sign, blah, blah, blah. What we're going to do is we're going to take this information for this particular part of the sign, and we're going to totally erase it. And then we are going to apply our own title to it, and then adjust the lighting and so on and so forth so that it looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try and find a good representative frame of this sign. So when I'm scrolling through my footage here, I can see that the sign gets pretty hot. It gets a little overexposed right here as the sun came out during that time lapse. We all know that controlling exposure during a time lapse is pretty challenging because the sun changes, especially on a day like this, partly cloudy. The sun changes so dramatically over the course of just a few minutes. So you kind of have to bracket your exposure and hope everything comes out okay. Well, in this particular circumstance, I've got some areas of overexposure, so I definitely don't want to use the overexposed part of the sign for this particular exercise. I'm going to go ahead and maybe put my playhead right here towards the beginning, and I can see that the sign is nicely exposed here. The shadows aren't too hard. The sun, the light itself isn't too hard on it. There's no hard shadows. And that's going to give me a good base for this particular composite. Now that I have a representative frame pulled here, I'm going to go ahead and go with my playhead parked on that frame. I'm going to go ahead and go to Composition, Save Frame As, File. And now I'm going to just save it, save it wherever you want. It'll come up with this Output Frame 2 dialog box. I'll just save it with my own particular L9 folder there. And I'll click on Save. And then what's going to happen is you're going to go back to your old render queue, the render queue. And this works just like the regular render queue that you are already familiar with, except instead of creating a movie, we're going to be creating a still image out of this. And the one that I normally choose from this drop-down box is the TIFF sequence with alpha selection here. If for any reason you don't have that in your menu of output modules, just go ahead and click on the name of one of these, any one of them. Okay, so it might be under here under lossless or something. I'll just go ahead and click on the lossless name there, and under format I'm going to change the format right here to TIFF sequence, and then that's all you really have to do. So format TIFF sequence right there, press OK. And you should have already chosen the output location, but if for some reason that didn't come up when you selected output frame, you could just click right here on the file name and then choose your location and file name itself, and then click save. Once you've got those two things lined up, the last thing that you should check on is render settings. Make sure that's set to best settings there. Normally you don't change that off of best settings. All these other ones are kind of for very specific purposes. Just keep it on best and you'll always be getting the best quality. Once you get all that lined up, just go ahead and click on render. It'll be a very fast render because it's just going to take that one individual frame and output it. And now I'm just going to go find that image that I output. So I'll just minimize my After Effects here, and there is my image. With this image, I'm going to right click on it and I'll just go to Open with Adobe Photoshop, and I'll open that up. You can also open up Photoshop and just go to File, Open, and open that image up as well. So now what we're going to do is we are going to erase all of the text and the design from this sign except for the red and green, or this kind of orangey red and green stripe right here, and the white, the background essentially. We're going to get rid of all of the other text so that we can go in After Effects and add our own custom text to it and lay it in really nicely. So to get rid of this background here, we're going to be using some special tools in Photoshop. And the first one that we're going to use is what's called the Clone Stamp tool and the Healing tool, the Healing brush. Both here, this is a little band-aid there, that's the healing brush, okay? And this is the Clone Stamp tool. If you're not already comfortable using these tools and you haven't used them before, I encourage you to watch the next section of the video, because that's going to show you exactly how to use the Clone Stamp tool and the Healing brush tool. You'll need to open up another image that I included with the L9 delivery folder to practice it. If you're already familiar with that particular tool from my previous class or from your own experience, you can go ahead and skip to the very next section of the video. So just skip ahead a few minutes until we get back to this image, and you can pick up and move forward. So go ahead and go into your L9 delivery folder, and inside of that L9 delivery folder you should see a footage folder right next to your project file, and then click inside of the stills folder there, and inside of there you should see an image that is not included in your After Effects project file. It's called 02start.tiff. Go ahead and right click on that and go to Open with Adobe Photoshop, and it should open it right up. So you look here, this is an old photograph and it's been damaged. And there's two tools I could use to help fix some of this damage here. And so the first one I wanted to show you guys was what's called the Clone Stamp tool. The Clone Stamp tool. So in 02start, I want you to take note of our fold in the picture here. We've got a damaged image from some kind of fold, it looks like. And this is from Adobe. This is like official Adobe training material. So it looks to me like this might even be fake, like they fake folded this in. But regardless, they have it here, and we're going to pretend like that's something that we've got to get rid of in this image to restore it to its original quality. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit there, and we're going to start working here in the sky. So to get rid of this, we can use what's called the Clone Stamp tool. And the clone stamp tool is located over here in your toolbox, and it should look like a big rubber stamp right there. If you left click on it and hold, that's the one that you should want. You do not want the pattern stamp tool, you want the clone stamp tool. And the clone stamp tool essentially takes one part of the image and stamps it onto another part of the image. And it works a lot like the paintbrush, but it's cloning something the entire time from one area of the image to the next. So you can paint one part of the image onto another part of the image. And that's perfect for this sky area right here. So the first thing you should set is the size of your clone, and I think I'm just going to keep it on 47 right now. Once again, it's just the size of your clone brush, right? Just like it was with the eraser in the paintbrush. And the next thing is to establish where you want the clone material to come from. So I'm going to take a piece of the sky from over here, and I'm going to clone that area over here. So to set the clone area, the area of the sky that you want to clone, hold down the Alt key. Now I got my clone stamp tool open. I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and that gives me that little target. And now I'm just going to click somewhere on the canvas, anywhere on the canvas here where you think that you're going to steal the sky from. So if I left click, I'm just going to do it over here, I think. I'm going to left click right there. Now I've told Photoshop that whatever, this area of the sky is where I want to start, is where I want to steal from. I want to take this area of the sky and I want to clone it over to here. And you can see right here as I hover my mouse now over the sky itself, or over that fold, it's showing me the texture. And it's showing me the area of the sky that I clicked on with the Alt button. So I set my clone position, or my clone area, by holding down the Alt key and then single left clicking. Now I release my Alt key and I'm ready to start painting. And watch what happens. So I'm going to start painting now. You can see as I paint away this particular scratch that it's showing me the area that it's copying it from. Okay? I just keep cloning it out there. Now that's not perfect, right? I can see a dark shadow right there because the area of the sky didn't work, but I just wanted to show you guys that as an example. So what I'll do maybe is I'll do my clone a little bit closer. Over here maybe. And I'll start left clicking and I'm just painting it in, right? It's just like I'm using the paintbrush. Except instead of taking a color, it's taking an area of the frame as I do this. And that's looking pretty good. It's not looking too bad. I can see a little bit of an edge there. But it's starting to help me clone out. It's starting to work pretty good there. So I can hold down the Alt key and reestablish a new clone location. So maybe I'll hold down the Alt key and I'll click right there on the border of the photograph. Now I can just kind of draw that area in to repair that. And up here as well. Get rid of all that stuff. And I'll just continue on downward with my clone tool. Reestablishing the clone area, right? So hold down the Alt key. I want to clone from over here now. I want to clone from over here now. I've got this area of the bridge, right, that needs to be repaired. So maybe I'll Alt click on the bridge itself. And I'll just try and steal it. There we go. So that gives you an idea of how this would work and how we can just completely and totally erase a flaw in an image in some capacity. So if I show the history of this work, I can just go back here all the way to open here. You can see there it is, and now it's more or less gone. Needs some more work, right? Needs some more blending. I can still see kind of roughly a shadow of where I did all that clone work there. But that gives you an idea of how this clone stamp works. And I can come up here and do the same thing right here. Once again, activate my clone stamp tool and select an area of the sky and just get rid of this scratch right here. Alt click on the area of the sky that I want to clone and just get rid of that scratch. It's very quick and very efficient. So the clone stamp is a great tool, absolutely wonderful tool, and it changed the way a lot of things worked in both photography and video. I mean, if you think about the amount of retouch that's done on models' faces and things like that for magazines and stuff, the clone stamp tool was really one of the the original tool for getting rid of skin blemishes and stuff like that. It was kind of one of the first tools that ever came out that could help you do that. Now we have even more sophisticated tools than that, but that just gives you an idea of how to use the clone stamp tool. Now the next tool that I'm going to show you guys is what's called the spot healing, spot healing brush tool, which is this band-aid right here. And the spot healing brush tool essentially works like the clone tool, but it's a much more automated way. So right there, spot healing brush. I'm just going to select that, and you'll see here that I now have another paintbrush. Now the cool thing about the spot healing brush is that you don't have to select an area of the shot to clone from. What Photoshop is going to do is look at your selection and compare it to its surroundings, and then automatically replace it with what colors and textures it thinks is best to get rid of it. Now, the spot healing brush does not work well on a large scale. It's for tiny little dots. So if I'm looking at this image, I can see these little itty bitty dots on the screen right here. Those are prime, targets for this type of work because it's very small. You wouldn't want to use the spot healing brush necessarily on that big scratch that went right down the middle, that big fold line that went right down the middle of the image. So with my spot healing brush activated, watch this. I'm just going to left click and hold and paint over one of these spots like so. And I'll do it again, and it gets rid of it automatically. So it's just like using the clone tool, except it's just using surrounding pixel information. It's finding the area that you think is bad. It's looking at it. You identify it by drawing over it. And then Photoshop is figuring out what makes it so bad in comparison to the rest of the image. And it automatically clones pixel data from around that spot to get rid of it. You can see how quick I could just blast through these spots, just healing so many of these tiny little dots so quickly. So you can see here it works really great on tiny little spots. Now if I were to come over here and let's say use the spot healing brush on this woman's arm, you can see that it doesn't really do much. It's not very effective at large scale adjustments. It really does have to be very small dots and things like that. So go ahead and continue practicing on this. Try and restore this whole photo if you can. Get rid of all those little dots and scratches and stuff like that. This is great practice. And man, it's a great Christmas present too. There's nothing better than taking an old photo from your family and restoring it and changing getting rid of the scratches and the fold lines and the age, and then reprinting it and then sending it to your family. It's a really great gift to give them. So okay, so now that we've learned the clone stamp and the spot healing tool, let's go ahead and use those techniques to get rid of all of that text on the sign. And the going is going to be pretty slow here, so let's go ahead and begin. With my layer selected, I'm just going to click on the clone stamp tool there, and again I will set my target, something like that. So I've got a nice white value there, and I'm also going to reduce the size of the clone stamp. Again, if you need to do that, you just come up here to the top toolbar. Right now it's set to 28. I can just drag that down a little bit, maybe to 18. And I'm just going to start slowly clone stamping out everything. Now, as you do this, you're going to notice that there's going to be like some patterns and stuff develop in the white here as you erase it. Don't worry, as we finish this out, we're going to get rid of some of those areas where the cloning is really apparent. So just go ahead and work through it. If you are still hesitant, you can watch me. I'm going to speed it up and show you guys how I'm doing it. Otherwise, I will see you in a few minutes when I'm done. So these edges here where you have sections of white, hitting that hard line and going into the tan, that is really a pretty big challenge, as is the side of the sign itself. And the best thing to do there when you're using the clone stamp tool, just like you did with the bridge, is to kind of align your clone target up to the very edge of the sign. So like maybe right here. So I'm just kind of putting the crosshair right on the edge. And then after I set the target there, you see that I'm cloning the edge of the sign along with the sky at the same time if I go directly up. So that's normally what I do when I come to an edge like this, is I clone the edge itself. You see I ran out of room there, so I got to come down again and clone again. Okay, so I went ahead and erased everything more or less using just the clone stamp tool. I did not use the healing brush that much because I just didn't feel like it worked too well in this circumstance. The thing that I'm seeing right now is that there's a lot of evidence of cloning. You can see repeated pixel values over and over and over again in the image here and up top as well. It looks very, very manipulated, which is not necessarily obviously what we're going for. So what we can do is we can paint over the top of this, to cover up some of these blemishes while maintaining a little bit of the cloning that we did underneath it, and that'll patch things up pretty nicely. So to paint just this area of the sign, what I'm going to use is the magic wand tool. And the magic wand tool is up here in the upper left hand corner of your tool bar. So if I left click right here beneath, it's kind of the fourth button down, if I left click and hold, you should see this magic wand tool right here. And if I select that, so I'm left clicking and holding on that button, then going into this sub menu, and then I release the mouse button once I have the thing that I want highlighted. So I want the magic wand tool, so I'm going to release my mouse button there, and it pulls up my magic wand tool. And what this tool does is it selects a specific area of the image for multiple reasons, but for our particular purpose it would be for editing. So if I come up here on this part of the sign and I just left click in the center of all that white, it's going to select all of the similar pixel values. So it's going to try and select all of the white for me automatically. Now once you have a selection like this open in Adobe Photoshop, the only thing you can do to the image at this point is within the boundaries of this particular selection. When nothing is selected in the image, it assumes that you can edit the entire image, but once you have a selection with a tool similar with the magic wand tool or something similar, now it can only edit within the boundaries of this box. Now I'm going to continue to refine this selection because I have left out some of my edges here, and I need to clean it up a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom back in a little bit with my magnifying glass, go back to my magic wand tool, and right there where there's a kind of a ragged edge on my selection, I'm just going to hold the shift key down, and you'll see when you hold shift with the magic wand tool active, you get that little plus sign. So I'm going to hold down shift and then select another area of the square here that has not been selected. So select right here in this ragged edge, and it went ahead and selected the rest of it for me more or less. Oh, there's a little spot right there, so I'll select that as well. Okay, cool. So now I have more or less a pretty nice neat square here, just that area that I had cloned out of all that old text. The next thing I need to do is refine this selection to something that's a little more natural. And if you're familiar with masking in After Effects, it's very similar to refining the edges of the mask. So with my Magic Wands tool still open and I've got my marching ants around that selection of the image, I can come up here to Select and Mask, this little button right here, and it's going to allow me to refine that selection. So you can see in my particular circumstance, only the selection is the true color of the image and everything else is red. You can adjust this right up here in this drop-down menu under View. So you could do selection on black, or black on white, I should say. So now just my selection is white, everything else is black. You could do something like this, where the image is kind of washed out except for your selection. All sorts of different views, but I normally use this red because it's very bold and I can very clearly see the edges. All sorts of refinements we can do here to the edge of this selection in particular. The thing that I want to choose at this point is just the feather. So I want to just feather my selection ever so slightly, which is just going to kind of blur the edges of that selection a little bit and make it a little more organic looking, so that it's not just kind of like a really hard selection edge. So now we've got just that nice little soft box selected there. I can press OK after I feather it. And there we go. Now, Photoshop knows that I want to do something within the confines of this box. While we're at it, now that I have this box selected, I could just go back to my regular pointer tool up here, which is at the very top of my toolbar. And I could just kind of left click and grab it, and I could just move it off of the image as well. So there's all sorts of things a selection will do for you, but in our case what we wanted to do is kind of create a canvas on the image with which we could paint. And that's what this marching ant selection is showing us. That's our canvas in the center. So now that I have my canvas made, I can come over here to my paintbrush tool, which is in your toolbar. It's just a regular old paintbrush. And this tool works almost identically to the same old paintbrush you're probably used to from Microsoft Paint back in the day. It's a little more refined. It works a little bit better, and it creates much better results, but it's the same exact concept. So I can left click right there on my paintbrush, and now I have my paintbrush active. Thing I want to do before I start painting is adjust some of the parameters of the brush. So first off, I want to change the size of the brush so it's a little bit bigger. So up here in the toolbar, I should see that little brush size menu, so I'll click on that, and I can choose all sorts of different brushes here. Just the regular old general brush is going to be fine for us, and we can keep it hard as well. Though you can see right here there's also the soft brush, which has a much softer edge. We've already softened the edges of our canvas, so softening the brush is really not going to do much for us. But I am going to increase the size of my brush pretty substantially so I can get a nice result. And the next thing that I'm going to do is alter my flow. Now right now my flow is set to about 60%, which is more or less what I want it to be. Your flow may be set to 100% or something like that. The flow is the speed and the strength of the flow of paint out of the brush and onto your image. So when you have it set to something that's a little lower, you know, not so much paint is going to go on, and you'll have kind of a layered effect where you'll still be able to see the image beneath it. So when I adjust my flow down to like 60%, it's kind of like it's painting over the image, but some of the image will still be apparent underneath it. If you adjust your flow all the way up to 100%, that's kind of like 100% opacity, and the paint is going to be very strong on the canvas. So I'm going to drop that back down to right around 63 or 62%. And the last thing I need to do is select the color. And to select the proper color for this image, I'm going to sample the color from the image itself so I get the exact shade of white of the sign. And to do that, all you have to do is come down here in your toolbar and you find the color palette, which is right here. So if I click on that little square, it's going to open up my color palette. And now that I have my color palette open, I'm not going to choose a color by trying to match it within the confines of this color picker. I'm actually just going to hover my mouse over the image itself, and you'll see when you do that that you get the eyedropper. So I'll just eyedropper kind of a representative color from that area, so something maybe in the middle for me. You could choose something else for you, but this looks pretty good to me, so I'll just click right there. And it's going to find the exact shade of white that's in that area. You can see it's kind of a tealish white. It's a teal, but it's very, very, very light teal. Now that I have that area sampled, okay, you can just press OK. Now I've got my proper white color for that sign selected. I've got my canvas laid out for me, and I've got my brush settings set to 47 size and the flow set to 63. So now I can just kind of left click and hold and just paint, just kind of like you're coloring in a coloring book, except the lines are going to, you know, those marching ants are going to keep your paint within the confines of the lines, and you don't have to worry about coloring outside of the lines. So again, I just left clicked and held. So again, I just left click and hold. And I'm just painting right over just like I would in Microsoft Paint. So just to give you an idea of what would happen if I didn't have that selection, those marching ants around this area of the sign, well, I could just color over anything I wanted to. All right? So that's not something that we want. I'm going to keep those marching ants, you know, keeping my brush strokes within that confines of the white area of the sign, and I'll just paint right over it. And I'm going to do the exact same thing to the white area beneath it at the very bottom of the sign there. So you can see right there that's actually generated a pretty decent effect. It's covered up a lot of my little errors there, and it looks pretty good. I'm going to do the exact same thing to this lower area of the sign, so I'll use my magic wand tool and I'll select it. I'll use my shift key to add selections to it as I go, just continually adding small sections of the sign wherever needed. And now I'll just come up here to select and mask, refine it by feathering it, and I'll press OK. Now I've got my canvas laid out for me, and I'll just go in with my paintbrush. I will select another representative color from down here, press OK, and now I'll paint it in. And I'm going to be very careful around this seam here because I want to maintain the integrity of that seam. So I'm just being very careful around there, trying not to paint over that. And I think that looks pretty good. So I'll just go ahead and deselect it by pressing Control D. And I'm good to go. Okay, so if I zoom out to 100%, you can see there I'm on my way to creating an empty sign. The next thing I need to do is handle these green and red stripes right here, which are problematic because they've got this overlapping pictures, and they also have some text on there. So the best thing to do, in my mind, would be to make another canvas selection, another selection of the image, and just paint over them with a green shade that's more or less representative of that area. So instead of using the magic wand tool, if I were to use that wand tool now, it's not going to select that text for me. It's going to be kind of sloppy. I can use what's called the polygonal lasso tool to kind of build a selection from scratch. And this polygonal lasso tool works very similarly to creating a mask in After Effects. So if I come up here and hover my mouse over this third icon here, if you left click and hold, you have three different tools. You have the magnetic lasso tool, polygonal lasso tool, and the lasso tool. The one that we want to use for this circumstance is the polygonal lasso tool. So I'll go ahead and click on that. And this is just like creating a mask. So now that I have that tool selected, just come over here to the corner of the sign, and I'll single left click to add a point. And then I'll come over here to the other corner, add a point, come over here to this corner, point, point, and then to close it, it's just like closing a mask. So I just go back to my original point. I get the little circle there, and I single left click to close it out. Now I've got that area of the sign selected. And because I use my polygonal lasso tool, it's more or less geometrically accurate. The only thing I want to do now is go back to my select and mask here. You can see how hard the edges is of that selection, so I'm just going to feather that out some. Just ever so slightly, not too much. And then I'll press OK. Now I'll come in here with my paintbrush tool, and once again I will cover that up. So I'm going to select an area of that green that I think is representative, keep my flow down to like 63% or something like that, and I'll just paint right over it. Now to deselect this selection, I just hit Control D, and it closes that out, and you can see right there that I've created more or less a pretty realistic green stripe across there. And I'm going to do this exact same thing to the red now. Okay, we're on our way here. Last thing I need to do is get rid of all of these pictures in the middle. And once again, I'll use my polygonal lasso tool, and I will select an area of the frame just around those pictures there. Okay. And now that I've got that selected, once again, I'll come up here to select and mask, feather it, and I will paint that in now. Now I'm just going to go back, and I have a couple places like right up here with the clone stamp tool. I need to clean that up, and I also need to clean up this edge. So I'm going to continue to use my polygonal lasso tool, my paintbrush, and my clone stamp tool to alter and fix this sign. Okay, so now I've got more or less an empty sign. Went in there, I erased everything, and I've just got the basic design from the original sign over here. And what we can do now is we can add some text in there and make it look like it's sitting within that sign realistically. So what we need to do is we need to save this image so that we can re-import it into After Effects. So I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'll just go ahead and save it as a TIFF, and I'll save it as Jackson Square Edited. As file type, you could do TIFF or you could do PNG. Those are my two strongest recommendations. You don't normally want to do a JPEG for this type of work because a JPEG file is in fact a compressed file, and PNG and TIFF files are normally not compressed, or they have very little compression. So I'll make sure TIFF is selected here, and I'll press Save. And under image compression, like I said, you could choose none here, which is exactly what you want. And I'll just press OK. Now that I've got that image saved, I'm just going to go ahead and close out Photoshop. I'll go back to After Effects, and to get that image back into After Effects, I'm just going to go to my project window here and double click on an empty area of the project window, and now I'll find that edited picture. There it is. I'll press Import, and there's my image. So I'll just go ahead and keep my project organized by moving it into my stills folder. And now I'm just going to left click on it and drag it down, and I'll just drop it right onto the timeline. So now you can see that everything's perfectly aligned. It's covered up my original sign there. I can kind of toggle off and on to see how it's erased it. But of course the biggest problem right now is that the rest of the image is no longer moving. It's just a still image sitting on top of that base layer. So I need to mask this particular edit, the image, so that it's just around the sign itself, and all of this stuff over here can remain in motion. So I'll make sure that my Jackson Square Edited TIFF image there is selected. I'll come up here with my pen tool, activate that, and I'm just going to do a very simple mask kind of right along the edges of the sign there, and I'm going to probably have to come back here and edit it a little bit because the sign is very complicated and complex. But for right now I'm just kind of doing an inside move here, and I'll close that out. Okay, now we're starting to get in business here. Okay, so now we can kind of see what's happening here. We've got the image laid over there, and we can kind of see it's very roughly composited in. We need to obviously adjust the edges some. You can see how nicely it's going to sit in the image in the end. Okay, so now that we've got that done, it's time to edit the edges of this mask and refine. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the mask parameters here, and I'm actually going to adjust the color of my mask because it's very difficult to see the mask with the white cloud cover and everything else. So under your timeline in the mask section there, you can just click on the little colored box just like you would with a layer. You can click on that and you can assign a brand new color to it, and I'm just going to do something really bold like a bright red, and that's going to make it much easier to see. Okay, now that I have my mask lines more visible, I'm just going to come in here and I'm going to refine the edges of this mask where it needs it. So you can see right here, you know, there's areas like there's the red banner, that little red banner right there. You know, that's showing up from the former image. So I need to add some mask points in here and refine it a little bit more. To add a mask point, just to recap, keep your pen tool open, and you can just kind of hover your pen over the mask line itself until you get the pen tool with the plus sign next to it. And now I can just single left click, and that's going to add a new point. And I'm just going to kind of refine this as much as I can, move it over to the side as much as I can in these particular areas that need it. Adding mask points as I go of where I need them, like right here. I got a little bit of that white banner at the bottom showing through, so I'll add some mask points down here to elongate that. But you don't want to have every single mask point along the very edge of the thing, because it's not going to blend together as well. So just get your mask points to the edge when you need it. Okay, so now I've refined the edge of my mask there so that it's more or less encompassing the entire sign where it needs. The next thing I'm going to do, just for a little bit of safety, is I'm going to feather my mask ever so slightly. So if you're not aware of how to feather a mask, that's more or less just blurring the edges of your mask. You can just open up the mask parameter down here, and under mask feather, I'm just going to increase that. And I can solo this right now just to show you. Right now I've got a very hard mask line. It's very, very hard. So I can just feather it ever so slightly, and that's going to give me just a slight amount of blur along the edges, kind of a gradient of opacity along its edges, and that's going to help blend that mask in to the rest of the image. Okay, so I feathered mine about 6 pixels. I'm going to go back and refine just a little bit more along the edges of the mask where it needs to. Alright, so now I've got pretty good composite there. So now that we have the sign in, it's time to add just a little bit of lighting motivation. You can see the light changes on the sign over and over and over again there as the sun kind of dips in and out of the clouds. Well, what we can do here is take the sign itself, the real sign, and blur it, and then use the blurred image to light the sign. So I'm going to come up here, and with my original layer selected, the Jackson Square time-lapse layer, I'm going to select that, and I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate it. And I'm going to move that layer up to the top of my image, of my composition there, so it's sitting on top of that original TIFF that we edited. And now with this done here, I'm just going to go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Fastbox Blur. And I'm going to give it a really strong blur, like a really strong blur. We're going to totally get rid of most of the text if we can, so as much as we can. So now if I look at that, you can see here that the words are gone, most of the graphic design is gone on the original sign, but we're still getting that sunlight passing through, adjusting the luminance of the sign over time. It's apparent. So what I can do now is add this blurred image slightly over the top of my Jackson Square edited sign. And there's a number of ways to do this. My recommended way would be to use the Jackson Square edited, this layer, as a track matte. If you remember from last class, the track mattes are layers that dictate the opacity of another layer. So I can create a track matte out of this particular layer here just by selecting the TIFF layer and duplicating it. So press Control D or Command D, and I'll move that up to the top. Okay, and now, so if I solo this, that is the layer itself, and I can turn this into a track matte, which basically is going to cut out my blurred layer in the exact shape of this particular layer. So now with my Jackson Squared time lapse, that blurred layer selected, I'm going to come over here to my track matte column. Again, if you don't have track matte, make sure your two buttons down here in the bottom left hand corner are turned on. And I'm going to assign a track matte to my blurred layer. So just come over here, Alpha Matte, Jackson Square, edited. And there we have it. So it's turned off that TIFF layer above it, and it's using that TIFF layer's mask as its own mask beneath it. So now we have this blurred layer, and it's only sitting on top of the sign itself. Now what I can do is I can come over here and open the opacity controls, and maybe I'll just drop it down. I'll drop it down significantly here. 36% maybe a little bit less than that. And so now the luminance of the sign is actually affecting the composite, the TIFF image. You can see it's brightening and darkening as we go here. So the next thing I'll do on top of adjusting the opacity there is I'll come over here to my blending mode, and I will change that maybe to an overlay. You can see right there the overlay, the image is now being overlaid, and that's really creating a greater sense of the sun's change. So that's pretty much what I want there. So essentially I've got a great base now. I've gone in, I've erased all the text and all the graphic elements there. I've composited it back in, and then I've added some lighting motivation back onto it so that it's matching up with the sign next to it. And now it's time for us to just add some text in there. So before I add some text in, I'm just going to do some organization here, and I need to label my layers and make sure that I know in the future what I've done. So the top layer, of course, would be the track matte. So I'm going to rename that track matte. Lighting layer. And then I'll rename this layer, that blurred layer, I'll name it lighting. And I'll name the TIFF image sign replacement. And I'll just leave the original down there as its original name. I could also color code these so I know which pairs go to where. So the track matte and the lighting layer are both working together, so maybe I'll assign them the same color, and then I'll assign these different colors as well. Okay, so now that I've got this in here, it's time for me to add some text. For my imaginary sign here, my imaginary advertisement, I'm going to say this is for the French Quarter Fest. So let's go ahead and give that a shot. Alright, so to create a title, I'm just going to use the regular old title tool, just like we've already been using. So I'll click up here on my title tool here, and I'm just going to draw roughly where I want the text to go on the sign. And I'm going to create multiple text layers here for different areas of the sign. So I'm going to say that my title is going to say the 37th French Quarter Fest. So maybe I'll make 37 or 37th really big here at the very top. So I'm just going to type in 37th. And then right here, like where it says TH there, if you look inside of your character menu, you actually have a little superscript. So I can click right there, I'll highlight TH and I'll click on superscript, and it's going to pop that up there and make it look really nice. The next thing I'm going to do to make this really seated within the sign itself is to use the sign's colors for the text. So right now I've got black, which doesn't really match up really well. It looks kind of unnatural. So I'll just select my text here, and in the character menu I'll use the eyedropper tool right here to maybe make this 37th kind of the tan from the sign. And I'm also going to go ahead and adjust the font size a little bit, just ever so slightly, maybe not too much bigger. Okay, so now if I go back to my selection tool and I drop that on there, looks pretty cool, but it's not matching up with the 3D, the geometric configuration of the sign itself. So what I have to do is put this title in 3D space and then rotate it in 3D space so that it's actually matching up with the rotation of the sign. So with the 37th layer selected here, I'll just come over here, and once again there's that little 3D toggle. So I'll just click right there to make the layer 3D. And now that I've got the 3D toggle active and the layer is in 3D, I'm going to check my composition settings to see which engine I'm working with. For this particular composition, the classic 3D engine is going to be just fine, and it's not going to take up too much resources. So I'll hit Control K, and I'll go to the advanced render or 3D renderer section, and I'm going to make sure that classic 3D is selected in this menu instead of Cinema 4D. And then I'll just press OK. Now that this layer is in 3D space, I can just twirl down the transform properties here in the timeline. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the X, Y, and Z rotation to try and match up the angle of this text. So again, I'm rotating the title in 3D space there. And I'll adjust my Z rotation as well. And I'll also go ahead, I'm going to make this a lot bigger, so I'll adjust my font size as well so that it matches up. Now getting the exact 3D orientation is kind of a painstaking task, and it's very critical, because if you don't get it right, it's not going to look right. It's not going to look like it's seated within the frame. So it takes just a little bit of tweaking. And the thing I'm doing is I'm referencing my diagonal lines and my horizontal lines to see where I'm at. So I want these horizontal lines right here on the title to be flush with these diagonal lines that are also running horizontally in the frame. So I'm going to try and adjust my Z rotation to where that is approximately the same. And I'm going to use these vertical lines here to try and match up with the vertical lines of my title. So go ahead and take a few minutes and try and find the correct 3D orientation of your title. Okay, so I went ahead and found something that works for me pretty well. I can tell you that I used a combination of X, Y, and Z rotation here, and I also used what's called the orientation controls. So the orientation controls are a way of rotating your layer, but they rotate it differently based on a different set of rules. And so you can, if your ZX rotation is not rotating your image right, you might want to come up here and rotate it using the orientation controls, because that may give you the rotation that you are looking for. Okay, so now that I've got the hard work of matching up this text layer to the kind of 3D orientation of the sign itself, instead of starting another text layer with and then reorienting it and everything like that, I'm just going to duplicate this text layer so that it can kind of maintain the same orientation roughly. And I'm just going to go on down and create the rest of my title. So again, my title is going to say 37th French Quarter Fest. And I'm going to go ahead and speed this up so you guys can see what I've done. But you can, put whatever title you want, whatever you think looks good. Okay, so that is a good start. I think I need to continue to adjust my 3D orientation. You'll notice that, you probably noticed already that, each one of these titles probably needs to be adjusted individually from one another to match with the changing geometrics of the sign. This was shot with kind of a wide angle lens, and so the bottom of the sign is a little bit wider and at a different angle than the top of the sign. So you got to kind of continue to tweak those 3D coordinates and that 3D rotation of every text until you think you've got it. But generally, that's looking like a pretty good start right there. And the last thing I might do to these letters is, I might come in here and I might just adjust the opacity down to 90% of every title. And that's just going to give them a little bit of interplay with the sign beneath it. You can also come in here and play with your blending modes by all means, but it's going to change, just a little bit of its opacity so it's not incredibly bold. And now if I play this back, you see I get a pretty good result. I've got that light flickering off and on. And it's looking pretty good. Now, if I wanted to affect the titles with the same amount of light that the sign is getting affected by, well, I could just move this entire section, so the lighting layer and the lighting track mat, up to the top of the composition. And then now I've got some interplay there with the letters. So the letters are getting lit up at the exact same time that the sign is getting lit up, and things are looking pretty darn photorealistic right there. So that looks pretty nice. I'll continue to adjust the brightness of my letters and tweak those so that it matches up. But overall, that's a really good start. So that is another example of how Photoshop, directly helps, those of us who are doing motion graphics. This is a frequent ask that you're going to be asked to do in, a professional environment. And also, even if you're making like a short film and you've got to replace the sign on a building with an imaginary company or something like that, this is exactly how you would do that. You'd go into Photoshop, change up the letters of the sign, and then composite it back into the image. And then hopefully add in some lighting motivation as we've done here. So I hope you get to put this to use. Alright, so our last composition in this class is going to be a pretty fun composition here. If you go to the map composition, you'll be able to see what we're starting with. So we've just got a little map of Europe here. You can kind of grab it around, drag it around your screen if you want to take a look, but it's just kind of an old-fashioned, vintage-looking map there. And what we're going to do is we are going to do a map line, an animated map line across the map. People always associate this with Indiana Jones, but there's so many uses for this particular graphic that I thought it would be important to show you guys a way of doing this, because it's used in many different regards outside of just that particular movie. So what's going to happen is we're going to start in a city, any city that you want, and we're going to move, draw a red line across the map and animate it to another city, implying that there's some form of travel going on from city to city there. And then after that, we're going to come in with a 3D camera and we're going to animate it so that it's tracking this red line as it's drawn across the map. and we'll add in some depth of field and some out of focus areas to make it look photorealistic, and then color correct it to wrap it all up. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and choose a flight or a train, maybe, who knows, from Paris to the Ukraine, right over here. And for starters, I need to create my line. And at the beginning here, things are going to look pretty plain, but you'll see as we build and build and build in complexity that you can really create a very nice looking image. So the first thing I need to do is draw my line from Paris to the Ukraine. So I'm going to do that on a new layer. So I'm going to go to Layer, New, Solid. And it doesn't matter what color solid you choose. I'm just going to go ahead and choose black here. And I'll call this Map Line. Press OK. And now we've got our map line layer there. It's black, so we can't see anything. So I'm just going to go ahead and toggle the layer's visibility for right now. And now I'm going to draw a line from, destination to destination. So I still have my map line layer selected. And I'm going to come up here to my pen tool. And with my map line layer selected, I'm going to draw a nice line between my two different destinations, whatever your destinations may be. So I'll go from here, and I'll put a map or a single point there. And I'm actually going to do a curved line. So to do that, once again, you're going to want to use those Bezier curves if that's what you want. You could also do a straight line if you'd rather. But I think the curved line looks pretty cool, so I'm going to come over here and left click and hold. And now I'm just going to drag upwards, and that's going to bring out my Bezier handles. Then I can just release them, and now that I have the Bezier handles created, I can grab the handle of the Bezier and stretch out that curve to whatever I think looks good. So I'm going to kind of do like a dramatic line. Dramatic curve there. So I guess this is more like a flight. Okay, so now I've got my line created, and we're going to go back and use our trusty stroke effect. So I'm going to come over to my effects window, and you can see my effects window has been hidden by all of the text editing I've been doing. So if I wanted to find it, I could just go to Window, Effects and Presets. And that'll bring that up. And then in here, I'm just going to type in stroke. And there it is, stroke. So now I'm going to apply that to my map line layer. And I'll go ahead and toggle visibility for that map line layer now just by clicking on that eyeball again on the left-hand side of the timeline. Okay, so now I have stroke applied, and you can see the layer itself. The line has been drawn. Pretty cool. I'm going to go ahead and do the old-fashioned red line. So under color here, I'll just change that to kind of a bright red for right now. And I may use my blending modes later to kind of adjust that and blend it in with the map itself. Now this should all be review from the last couple times that we've used this. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust my brush size so that the line is much bolder. And instead of a straight line in this case, I'm going to actually change the brush size. Or I'm going to change the way that this line is drawn. I can actually do a dotted line here by simply adjusting my spacing section. So I can just drop my spacing down, or actually increase my spacing, I'm sorry. And you can see when I increase the spacing, you'll see what's actually happening is that this line is actually created by a series of dots. And if I take my spacing down to 0, those dots form a solid line, but if I space them out, you can actually see them. So now I've got my dots made. Maybe I'll adjust my brush size a little bit so that it's smaller. Okay, so now I've got a cool little dotted line going across black right now, and that's because I don't have my paint style correctly set right here. So I'm going to go to paint style, and I will change that to on transparent. This is a little different than what we've used before. We have been using this reveal original image thing here to do a right effect. But right now we're doing on transparent. And there we go. So now we have our bright red line from destination to destination. Okay, so now that that's done, we can animate that line over time. Very easy, just like we've done in the past. I'm going to start my animation maybe at 1 second, so I'll park my playhead at 1 second, and I will adjust my end value here so that it goes all the way back to 0. I'll hit that start keyframe, and then maybe I'll go, let's make this a fairly long animation, so maybe to 10 seconds or so. And I will adjust the end back to 100%. So now if I watch that, I've got my little dotted line going across the map right there. Cool. Okay, so that's looking pretty cool. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use some blending modes and try and blend in that red line a little bit so that it looks like it's actually being drawn on the map. Right now, just like our Banksy at the beginning of the lesson, it's just a bunch of red dots on top of a more or less organic looking image. So I'm going to change my map line mode maybe to multiply. And there we have it. So now the red is starting to blend in with the letters and the borders and everything beneath it. It's starting to look like it was directly drawn onto the map, which is cool looking. Now the next thing I could do to create a sense of depth, okay, is to add what's called a drop shadow to this line. And a drop shadow is simply a fake generated shadow that's based on the geometry of your layer. So to create a drop shadow, we need to alter the layer's style. So I can right click on the map layer and go to layer styles. You can see there's all sorts of different styles that you can choose here. For mine, I'm going to choose drop shadow. But you can also do like a glow and a bevel, so create kind of more or less a 3D effect, a color overlay or a gradient overlay. Plenty of things to experiment and mess around with, but it's more or less just adjusting, the layer style in the exact same way that you would be adjusting it in Photoshop to blend a layer in or to add something around the edges of a layer. So I'm going to choose drop shadow from this menu. And when I do that, it creates those nice little shadows underneath it. So now that I've added that in, I can come down here to my layer styles in the layer controls, twirl down the disclosure triangle for drop shadow, and now I have all of the adjustments I can make for the shadow itself. So I can adjust the opacity of the shadow so it's a little bit lighter, which I'll probably do. And I can also adjust the angle. So wherever the light source is coming from, that's going to adjust the shadow. And then I'm also going to adjust the distance so it looks like the line is kind of hovering at a higher altitude above the map itself. So that's what that distance parameter does. So if I adjust it really steep, it really distances the shadow. Now what's cool about adding this drop shadow effect as a layer style is that as the line builds itself, the shadow follows along. So sometimes you can create fake shadows manually by duplicating a layer and making it really dark and then blurring it or something like that. But oftentimes this drop shadow is a really easy and elegant way to get the same effect. It doesn't work every time, but when it does work, it works great. Okay, so to further add a sense of movement to the piece, I'm going to go ahead and create kind of a circle, a growing circle that grows out of my destination once the dotted line reaches it. So to do that, I'm just going to make sure that none of my layers are selected right here. And I'll go back up to my rectangular marquee tool, or the rectangle tool there. Okay. So we have been using this to create masks today, but you can also use it to create just shapes. So if I left click on that button, I can find the ellipse tool, which is what I want. So I'll just click on the ellipse tool there. And now, with none of my layers selected, I can just draw a simple circle. Just like so. Now, when you have a layer selected on the timeline and you use one of these shape tools, it creates a mask, which is not something we want right now. If you don't have anything selected, it just creates a shape when you draw it. And it creates a new layer called a shape layer, and it's more or less a vector-based shape. So I'm just going to create that little circle there. And once the shape layer has been created, you have adjustments that you can make. So I can adjust my stroke over here, which is the outline of the shape. So I can adjust the thickness of the stroke and also the color of the stroke. I'm going to keep it bright red just like the rest of the lines there. And I can also adjust the color of the fill, which is whatever's inside the shape. In this circumstance, I definitely don't want a fill. I just want kind of the red circle kind of radiating out of the city center there. So I'm going to come over to my shape layer and open up the contents of the layer. And you'll see the name of the circle. And then I want to select fill 1 here, right there. And I'll just hit the delete key. And there's my stroke, so if I selected that and hit that, it would also delete the outer circle, and the ellipse path is the actual line that we've drawn here to create the shape. So now that I've got my fill deleted, I'll go ahead and change the mode to multiply, just like the red lines. So what I'm going to do is, as soon as the line, or as soon as that travel line hits kind of the city, I'm going to scale this upwards so that it kind of radiates out and emphasizes this new place that they've traveled to. And to do that, I'm going to once again open up my contents here. I'm going to ignore my transform properties for this shape layer and just focus on the contents here. So that's exactly where we saw the fill layer and all that other stuff that we were just talking about. Beneath that, you'll see transform ellipse 1. Now this is a little confusing, right? Because you have transform properties for the layer itself, but you also have the transform for the ellipse, which is exactly the one that we want right now. If I were to use my transform properties here on the layer side, you know, the anchor point's way over here, so if I scaled this, it's going to scale towards the center of the screen more or less, which is not what we want. Instead, if we use the transform properties of the shape itself, not the layer, it will scale down within itself. So I'll come over here, and as soon as that dotted line kind of hits the city, I'm going to start keyframe. Actually, I'll go back a couple frames before it hits the city, and I'll just keyframe the scale, maybe so that it starts small, like right around there, right around the edge of the city there, like so. And then I'll just have it grow outwards, just like that. So now what we have is lines come in, lines come in, lines come in, and boom, when it hits it, we get this expanding red radius there, which is kind of cool looking. I'll go ahead and also keyframe the opacity so that it kind of fades in and fades out, and it's not just sitting there waiting. So I'll just adjust the opacity here so that it fades in as soon as the last square hit, or the last circle hits. And then as it radiates outward, I'm just going to do a slow fade out. So I'll just add another keyframe there and really slowly over a few seconds fade it out. There we go, that looks pretty nice. Let me get a look over here at everything that we've done so far. So there's my line, it's traveling, and there we go. Got a nice little red circle there growing. Okay, cool. The last thing I'll do to this layer before I leave it alone is I'll add that drop shadow in. Now, to get the exact drop shadow that I added to the map line, what I can do is open up the map line, and under the layers, styles category there on the timeline, I can just select the drop shadow parameter, press Control C, and then come back up here to my shape layer that I don't have the drop shadow on, and press Control V to paste it in, and now I've got a shadow that's the exact same distance and size and opacity as the line itself. Okay, cool. Alright, so we've got kind of a neat looking composition here, but it's also very plain, right? We don't have any camera moves. It's just kind of boring to watch. So let's go ahead and add some camera moves into this to create a really nice sense of movement. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with After Effects cameras, essentially you can create a digital camera in After Effects and then reframe your composition and reshoot it from different angles, or move the camera and animate it over time, just like a real camera. That's what we're going to be doing right now. And the first thing that you have to do before you create a camera is make sure that any layer that you want to be seen by the camera is a 3D layer. So I'm going to come over here to my shape layers, all my layers on my timeline right now, and I'm just going to activate the 3D toggle for all three of those layers. And then I'm going to come over here to Layer, New, Camera, and I'll create just a brand new camera. Default settings are perfectly fine, and I'll press OK. Alright, so nothing's really changed thus far. If I change my composition view to 2 views, which is what we'll need to do, so right down here under the composition window you should see 1 view. I'm going to go ahead and change that to 2 views horizontal. And now I've got the 2 views. So if you're not familiar with this interface, essentially the left side here is what's called top, and I can change the view, okay, so front or left or back or right, but it's essentially an overhead view of my composition. If I select my map here, you'll see that that vertical line right there, that horizontal line, is my map, and my shape layers are all sitting on top of it as well. Then if I select my camera, you'll actually see like a little square, something that very roughly resembles a camera is there as well. So one thing that's crazy about After Effects cameras, they're kind of notorious for how difficult they are to control, given the actual controls in the camera layer itself on the timeline. So normally I don't like to necessarily control the camera with the camera's built-in controls. I actually create a null layer, as we've done in the past, and I use that null object to control the camera instead. So I'm going to go over here to Layer, New, Null Object, and I'll rename that null to camera control. And I'm going to parent, just like we did last time, the camera to the camera control. So I'm going to come over here to my parent and link column. There is the parent pick whip. I'm just going to left click on that, drag it over, and I'm going to parent it right. Ooh, I almost made a mistake there. The null object itself, I need to toggle 3D. Almost messed that up. So the null object, I toggled it to 3D. Now I can parent it to the camera control. And now with this null object created, I can move my camera and control it by controlling the null itself, and I don't have to ever adjust my camera controls. Just to give you an idea, if I open up the transform controls of the camera, I've got two things that are pretty painful to control. Number one is the position, which is the position of the body of the camera, and the other one is the point of interest, which is what the lens itself is looking at. So to control the camera, you have to manually keyframe both of those at the same exact time, and that gets pretty tedious, and it also creates problems sometimes. So just parenting a camera to a null object and using the null handle to control everything is oftentimes a better solution. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close my camera controls down, and I'll come over here to my camera control layer, and I'm going to come and place my playhead kind of at the beginning of the animation. So my animation started at 1 second, so I'll put my camera or my playhead like right there, right around the 1 second mark. And now I'm going to use my null object to control the camera. So if I zoom in on my top-down view over here, there's my camera control. I've got it selected in the timeline, and that's going to bring up the 3D handles on the layer itself. So if I zoom in, I've got my blue arrow, which is the z-axis, the red arrow is the x-axis, and the green arrow, which is currently pointing up at us, is the y-axis. To give you an idea of some of the other views, if you didn't take my class prior, I can come over here to my top down, or my menu here, and I could choose left. And it's going to show me a left facing view of this. So there's my camera, and there's all the layers that it's looking at. Or I could do right, or I could do back. Right, it's looking at it from the back. But most of the time, top will get the job done. So I'm just going to choose top right there. Now I'm going to grab that camera control, and I'm going to go ahead and bring my camera dramatically closer to my map because it's just too far away right now. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure camera control is selected in the timeline. It gives me that blue arrow, and I'm going to drag it forward, which is going to drag the camera forward as well. Just to give you a better view of that, as I drag the z-axis handle, left click on that blue arrow and hold. Now I can drag it down the z-axis, which is the depth axis. And I'm just going to get it really nice and close to my map. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to my rotation, and I'm going to adjust my Y rotation so it kind of rotates in. You can see as I do that, the camera is rotating with the null. So now I can get this kind of really nice, the image was so flat before, now I'm viewing the map from an angle, which is really cool. And it's given me, a great sense of depth, and it's showing the expanse of the map. It just looks like a more kinetic frame. Now that I've got that done, I'll adjust my Y position. So I can come up here in my top view and do that, or I can also see my Y-axis a little bit better in my record window. So I'll just grab that Y-axis there and drag it down so that my starting place, Paris, is better in frame. So go ahead and take a couple minutes and play around with that null and see if you can get a nice, cool starting camera angle. Okay, now that I've got a great, nice starting position there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keyframe all of the parameters of my null object. So I'm going to keyframe, I've got my playhead at the beginning of the animation, keyframe position, and all of my rotations, X, Y, and Z rotation. So I've got 4 keyframes there. And that's because when I end up on the back end of this, I don't know what I'm going to do with that null yet. I don't know how I'm going to reframe the end. So I need to just go ahead for safety and keyframe all the pertinent ones there. Now I'm going to go ahead and move my playhead all the way to the end of that animation of the map line, which I ended mine at 10 seconds. And you can see right here on my active camera view that it's kind of gone off frame. So I need to reframe the camera so that it, follows along with that red line to my new destination. First thing I'll do is I will adjust my rotation, so I'm like rotating around the other side of the map. Something like that. And then maybe I'll tweak my Y position as well. Okay, so that's all I really needed to do to get a good result there. I'm going to go ahead and close down my multiple views here. So I'll go change this from 2 views. I'll change that back to 1 view. And let's just watch what we have. Okay, cool. So when I'm watching this, everything looks pretty good. The thing I do not like is how the camera stops and starts. Ooh, look at that really mechanical stop and start, right? So we need to come over here and adjust the keyframe interpolation of my layers of my animation here so that we've got, kind of a nice gradual start and a nice gradual stop. And if you don't remember how to do that, the best and easiest way to do it is to right click on the keyframe. Your starting keyframes will use easy ease out. So if I right click on a starting keyframe, I'll go to keyframe assistant and go to easy ease out. And I'll continue to adjust these so they all ease out. And on the back end, my closing keyframes will use easy ease in. And now that I've got that, what that's going to do is that's going to generate a more gradual start and a more gradual stop. So things look a little more natural, almost as if it was a natural dolly move or something like that. Now that I've got that done, what I'll do is I need to further adjust those parameters. So I'm going to come over here, and with these parameters selected, I'll just open up my graph editor, and I'll kind of go through here one at a time and just make these more gradual. So I'll select the keyframes on the front and back end, use my Bezier handles to make it more gradual, and I'm just selecting the name of the keyframed parameter, and that's opening them up in the graph editor there. Okay, now let's take a look. Now I've got a really nice gradual start, and it'll be a really nice kind of slow stop. And I might also want to just move my keyframe over a little bit so that it doesn't stop at the exact same time that the line stops, because then that looks a little more mechanical. So just spread them out a little bit more so that the camera doesn't stop at the same exact time that the line does. You could do the same thing over here in the front. You could start the camera after the line starts to move, maybe. I'm just moving all those keyframes at once. Alright, that looks pretty cool. but it could look even better. So the next thing that I'm going to do, that I have my 3D camera out, is I am going to adjust the depth of field of the camera. So for those of you unfamiliar with the term, depth of field is essentially the range of in-focus material for any given camera in its current lens and other settings. So you can have shallow depth of field, which means that there's only a very small amount of material on the z-axis that's in focus. Or you can have really deep depth of field, which is where most of the image is in focus from the foreground to the background. For this type of shot, right now we have deep focus, which means that France is just as in focus right now as Poland is. And although that looks okay, it's not necessarily the most cinematic look, especially if you think that this is, a map. And to get a camera really close to a map like this in real life, it would inevitably result in really shallow depth of field based on kind of the rules of the lens and everything like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to shallow out our depth of field, and we're going to keyframe it over time to create a real sense of changing focus. So right back here at the very beginning of my animation, okay, got my playhead parked where my keyframes are. I'm going to go and actually open up the camera 1 control. So I'm going to ignore my null for right now and go over and open up my camera 1 controls. And I'm not interested in the transform controls of the camera. I'm interested in the camera options. So go ahead and open that up. And you'll see a parameter right here that says depth of field. So right now it's off. It's off by default because this takes up a lot of processing power on your computer. But I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust my aperture level right here, which is more or less going to determine how shallow it is. So the higher number we go, the shallower the depth of field, and the greater the sense you're going to get of what's in focus and what's not. So I went ahead and adjusted my aperture so it was much higher, into about 121 pixels or so. And now that I've got my depth of field really shallow, you see currently, based on my focus distance, Poland is in focus. So I'm going to actually adjust my focus distance so that it's a much smaller number. And that's going to eventually bring, and we're watching Paris, right? We want Paris to be in focus because it's kind of the beginning of the shot. So somewhere around right there, Paris falls into focus. In my case, it's about 955 pixels, but that's going to dramatically differ for you based on how you did your animation. And I'm also going to just go ahead and keyframe all this stuff. So I'm going to keyframe focus distance and aperture. And I'm also going to keyframe what's called blur level. So blur level is just a very simple adjustment. So if I drop my blur level to 0, then it pretty much turns off the depth of field and gives me deep focus. If I turn it back up to 100%, it's going to replicate, the focus settings that I've already set with the distance and the aperture. So I'm going to keyframe my blur level there as well. I'm actually going to go ahead and increase my aperture just a little bit more to really hone in on Paris there as well, and to create just a greater sense of this being a macro shot. Okay, so now that I've got that done, I'll just go towards the end of my animation and I'll find where the landing point is. I'm just going to make sure that my landing is in focus, which right now it's not. So I'll go to the very end, wherever my camera landed there, and I will adjust my focus distance so that Kiev is in focus right there. I think I'm going to drop my aperture a little bit as well so that more of that area is in focus. Now you can adjust and keyframe any one of these parameters to whatever you like. It's just showing you the controls there. And then in the middle of this, as I kind of scrub my playhead through, I can see that even though my focus is changing accordingly, everything in this particular area of the shot and the kind of the middle of the shot is now out of focus because it's not following along with the line. So I need to keyframe this kind of in the middle of the animation to adjust my focus distance again so that the map becomes in focus. So I'm just kind of tweaking it as I go, parking my playhead, making sure it's in focus. Okay, cool, that looks nice. So now I'm going to play this, and it's going to take a significantly longer time to render out because of the depth of field being active. That looks pretty cool. Alright, so to polish this up just a little bit more, I'm going to go ahead and create an adjustment layer at the top. Layer, new, adjustment layer. And once again, I'm just going to add that Lumetri color effect to it under color correction, Lumetri. And I'm just going to creatively color correct this. I'll probably warm it up some. And then I will also drop my curves to give it some more contrast. And then lastly, I will add a vignette to this as well. Here we go. Okay, so that is the end of our time together. I hope that you've enjoyed this series and that you've learned as much about After Effects as you can. Continue to explore After Effects. It is a perishable skill set. If you're not out there practicing and getting better at it every day, you'll eventually forget how to do the simple things, and then you'll never be able to do the hard stuff when you need to. I wish you the very best of luck, and please email me if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer them.